Good morning and welcome to the Newport News Church of Christ. Happy to have you here as a part of our Sunday morning Bible study. We welcome you and hope, trust, and pray that you'll continue to get something from our study in the life of Christ. We're on lesson 2. If you want to look on with the study questions, that we have some study questions for each lesson. We passed some out last week in the building. We passed out a pack that has the study guides for the next 20 lessons. But each Sunday I will send out, or each weekend I'll send out the individual lesson for that week. So if you wanted to look on, you can check your email on your phones or on your tablets, and those study questions should be in your email from this morning, and then you can watch along and you could try to answer those questions as we go through the presentation today. Continuing our study, we're looking at the life of Christ. Last week, we kind of looked at the 4 Gospels as we go to our PowerPoint now. Last week, we went to the 4 Gospels. And so today, our outlook is the political landscape, We want to see and understand what the world was like, the political landscape in the world was like that Jesus was going to come into. So it's important for us to understand some of that background. And the setting for that background is to understand what happens during the intertestament period, the time between when the Old Testament ends, the last writings of the Old Testament, and then the first events of the New Testament begin. We see Malachi. So why was there so much time before the sending of his son? We see that Malachi was the last Old Testament prophetic book to be written. Nehemiah was the last Old Testament historical book to be written. Brother Maxwell just did a thorough and very good study on the book of Malachi. We look at the Malachi, the last word from God before silence, before over 400 years of silence. Malachi was that last prophetic word to the people of the post-exile period. Nehemiah contains the last history. We have the history of the children of Israel in the Old Testament is contained in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and then the Chronicles that were written after the exile period. And then Nehemiah provides some valuable history as Nehemiah comes back and builds the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Right. So Malachi and Nehemiah, last prophetic book and last historical books to be written. It is proposed that the last Old Testament scripture was written around 430 to 425 BC. The first New Testament event occurred about 5 BC, about 5 years before the birth of Christ. It was the birth of John the Baptist, which would be the Lord's cousin. That leaves over about 400 years from the Old Testament to the New Testament scripture that we call that the intertestament period. However, if we listen to what Malachi left his readers with, we see in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1, Malachi says, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom ye seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom ye delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts." Malachi 3 and 1. It is observed that the natural, so we see here from Malachi 3 and 1 that there's a foreshadowing, there's a foretelling of the one that's going to come and prepare the way. And then also that the Lord, the Messiah, was going to suddenly come and appear in his temple. And so the Old Testament, we can sum up the whole Old Testament as pointing forward that says that someone is coming. And then the New Testament, the Gospels tell us that someone has come. And then the rest of the writings of the New Testament point back to that event and said, yes, someone has come, but a point is forward to the fact that someone is coming again. So old Malachi is pointing us forward that a messenger, behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way, talking about John the Baptist. And then the Lord whom ye seek will certainly come. Now, as we get down to the Old Testament, the world that Jesus would come into, the natural scenery is the same as when Abraham first pitched his tent in Shechem, but all else has changed. All right. So the world, the scenery and the background is similar to when Abraham first pitched his tent in Shechem, but all else has changed. So now, why was there so much time before sending his son between the Old Testament and the New Testament? We suggest three possible reasons why. God may have wanted to dramatize this event. And so by that space of time, that pregnant pause that happens between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament may be a fact to call more attention to it, to kind of dramatize the event of Christ's coming. God may have also wanted to make the fulfillment of the messianic prophecy more impressive. That could be a possible thing. These are suggested by F. Regard Smith. He writes, God may have simply been waiting until the religious and the political situation was exactly right for Jesus. As we see Paul in Galatians 4 and chapter 4 and verse 4, Paul says, but when the fullness of time had come, or when the fullness of time came, God sent his son, born of a woman, born unto the law, that he might save those that were under the law. So we probably go with more, why was there so much time? God's providence and his wisdom, his knowledge, his God's working still in the affairs of man and ruling and subruling in the affairs of man. God is waiting to the proper time for events to line up for him to send his son. And so when the fullness of time came, God sent his son. So that's why we have such a time period between. And God has always worked that way. Why did it? So we have that 400 years there. How long were the people down in Egyptian bondage? 400 years. So we have that same number. Why did God leave them down there in Egyptian bondage for 400 years? Well, we concentrate and look on the awfulness of the slavery and the bondage that they were into down there, but we really see that God was saving and preserving his people down in Egypt because some other stuff is going on in Canaan. All right, there's some wickedness and there's some wicked people. The thing that gets them down there is the great famine that took place. So they couldn't have survived in Canaan. So Joseph is already sent ahead. It makes way and prepares. The rest of the family is brought down and they prosper and they do well. We have about close to 60 people that go in Joseph's family. But how do they come out? Billions strong. So God, even though there's that austere condition down in slavery, God builds a nation and raises a whole nation of people down in Egypt, nourished by the goods and all those things that Joseph had put away. So that's God's providence to leave them down there in Egypt. And then at the right time, he sent Moses to go down there and bring them out and bring them back. Now they're ready to come back to Canaan and come back to the promised land. But so God, as we look at God's work, and if you look over here on this hand, you got to look at the other hand. What's God doing on the other side? You got to look at his providence. What seems like a terrible condition over here, no, God is really preserving and taking care of his people. And then when the time is right, he's going to bring them up out of Egypt. And so Egypt is kind of a holding place. We see that more than one time. We see Abraham go down to Egypt. We see the children, the Hebrews go down to Egypt. And then when the birth of Christ, to protect him from what's going on in Palestine, goes down to Egypt, stays down there 3 years. And then after things that the Herod has passed, then he can bring him out of Egypt. I have called my son, calls him back out of Egypt. So God uses things in his own way, in his own time. While he was doing something over here, he's preparing something over here. So we look at that time period in between the Old Testament, the New Testament, that silence. The world is being prepared. Things are going on in the world. They're going to line up and help the biblical story. And this is what we're looking at today. Sources of information about this time period, and that was the scripture, Galatians 4, when the fullness of time was come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law. Sources of the information during this time period of silence, we have apocryphal writings. Those are the 14 books that are in some people have them in their Bibles, but they're not as recognized as part of the canon. They were writings of that time period. We also have the writings of Josephus, a great historian who was born around AD 37 and survived the destruction of Jerusalem. So Josephus and his writings. He wrote a couple histories. One that goes back to Adam and Eve, and then he wrote one that deals with the wars that took place. And so we get a lot of great history from the writings of Josephus as he's writing on the times, and you can kind of corroborate. You can look at the Bible and corroborate them with some things that Josephus records. We also have miscellaneous Greek and Roman witnesses. We have different writings. You can go back to some of the Greeks and some of the Romans writings, and so they kind of corroborate what the Bible says, and so you can match some things up. We have archaeological findings and things that they found that match up, that give us clues of how people lived, give us clues about customs during that particular time period. So all those things help us to kind of get a picture of what's going on during that intertestamental period. The scriptures do give us some answers. Dr. Coy Roper has dealt with this period in his third commentary on the minor prophets. And so there's some writers that have dealt extensively with this period. So that's kind of how we know what kind of goes on. So we pull up verse, so we look at the apocryphal writings, we look at Josephus, we look at archaeological finds and things that have come forth that give us an idea about the culture and the flavor of things that was going on in this time period, the intertestamental period. Now we look at the political landscape at the time of Christ, the political landscape at the time of Christ. The political landscape of the time of Christ, what helps us to understand that period, we look at Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel chapter 2, we see the prophetic Daniel as he interprets King Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the great image. He says, "You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest of arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay." Daniel 2, chapter 30, verses 31 through 33. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that he, ruler of Babylon, was the head of gold, but went on to say, "Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these." Daniel chapter 2, verses 39 and 40. And so now, as we look at this and see from history, the four kingdoms that Daniel would be prophesying about were as follows. He's talking to Nebuchadnezzar, who was king of the Babylonian Empire. And then he would be overtaken and overthrown by the Medes and the Persians, the Mede and the Persian Empire. And they would come to rise and they would rule. And so during the time of the exile period, the Medes and the Persian. And then we have the Grecian Empire, Alexander the Great and his conquest, and then later to be followed by the Roman Empire. The most important part of this prophecy is focused on in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44. "And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people." So this is where we get prophecy about the kingdom of heaven being established. And when Jesus came on the scene, one of the things he did, we find in Matthew, is Jesus came preaching the kingdom of heaven is at hand or is near, right? So the kingdom of heaven will be established in the days of those kings. At the end of the Old Testament, Babylon had fallen and the Medo-Persian Empire was established. And that is what we will look at as we see next, the Medes and the Persian Empire. The Medes and the Persian Empire from about 539 to 333 BC. At the end of the Old Testament, Persia controlled Canaan. They still allowed the Jews to be in control, controlled by the high priest. This period is when Samaritans came along due to tensions between the Jews that were returning and the mixed race inhabitants. And we can read, you can see that in 2 Kings chapter 17 and 24. Remember when the northern kingdom had been deported by the Syrians and taken away to captivity, And then the Syrians brought people in to the land and to populate and take care of the land, but they had some problems when they were brought into the land because they didn't know how to take care of the land. And so they were punished, and they suffered greatly because they didn't know how to take care of the land, because the land belonged to God, and they didn't know how to give proper reverence and respect to God. And so they had to go find priests to bring them in to teach them how they should reverence and respect God so that they could prosper in the land. So back in that time, people were brought in when God's people were deported into captivity. And so that's when we get the Samaritans, this mixed race of people. So that's so they're in control of Canaan as the Old Testament ends. After that, you'll get the Grecian period. This period is also known as the Macedonian period because Alexander the Great was from Macedonia. Alexander the Great, we see him in 333 to 323. And in 336, he assumed command of the Grecian army at just 23 years old. He conquered the world in just a few years. And because of that, Greek culture spread. So Greek and Hellenism was spread by Alexander the Great. As he conquered the known world at that time and most of the world, he brought the Greek culture, Greek philosophy, the Greek language, and it spread throughout this region. And Greek becomes the predominant language. This is important to Christians because that is why Greek became the use of universal language. And the New Testament was written in Greek, in Koine Greek, or everyday language Greek, as opposed to classical Greek. Alexander the Great took control of Jerusalem in 333 BC. It was during this period that the scribes became a distinct class. The scribes, we'll talk about the sects in just a minute. We have the sects of the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots. All of them, the scribes become a distinct sect during this time period under Alexander the Great. Upon Alexander's death in 323 BC, his kingdom is divided up into 4 territories. We have Greece, we have Asia, we have Egypt, and we have Syria. The 2 that matter to us in the New Testament story are Egypt, which would be down to the southwest of Palestine. Here's Palestine, Egypt down to the south and the west, and then Syria up to the north and over to the east. Those 2 countries matter to us in the New Testament story. Egypt was controlled by the Ptolemies between 323 and 198 BC. Sitting between Egypt and Syria was Palestine, and it was trapped between the struggles between Egypt and Syria. Egypt and Syria struggle to be the dominant force or the dominant country in this time period. And so Palestine is caught in the middle. And so mostly during this time, the Jews were under the Egyptian control of the Ptolemies' rule. Under their rule, it was a peaceful time. It was also during this time that Ptolemy II commissioned a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures known as the Septuagint 70. All right. He also set up a library in Alexandria, Egypt, right there on the Nile. It was completed around 285 BC. And so the Septuagint was completed in 285 BC, called the Septuagint 70, which means 70. Created by 70 Jewish scholars. Finally, around 198 BC, Palestine came under Syrian domination. So you have the Egyptians that ruled for a while, then later the Syrians would come into control. Under Syrians, the Seleucids, they were in control from 198 to 165 BC. They are significant because they divided Palestine into 5 provinces, and these are the provinces that exist in Jesus' day. We have Judah, we have Samaria, Galilee, where Jesus is from, Perea, and then Trachonitis. The Syrian rule was the darkest in the history of Judaism. You have the villain Antiochus IV, as we see in Daniel 8 and 9 prophesied. Antiochus Epiphanes, he hated the Jews, tried to make Greeks of the Jews. He closed the temple, made circumcision illegal in that area, promised death to anyone who practiced Judaism. So the Egyptians were more giving, allowed the Jews to be controlled by the high priest, and gave them kind of a free reign to practice their religion. The Syrian ruler Antiochus Epiphanes did not. He hated them, made all those practices illegal. He offered a sow on the altar, a hog on the altar, poured the ashes into water, and then sprinkled the water throughout the temple to desecrate the temple. So they desecrated the temple during this time period. Then we get to the period of independence, 165 to 63 BC. The Jews were motivated to stop the horrible things that were happening to them, and they were led by a priest named Matthias, and he had 5 bold sons. One of them was named Judas the Hammer, or in translated, the hammer is also translated Maccabee. Maccabee is the translated for hammer. So Judas Maccabeus, we call this also the Maccabean period, reconquered Jerusalem in about 165 BC. The temple was rededicated to God, and the origin of the Feast of Dedication was established. And we can read that in John 10:22. The war with Syria continued until about 143 BC, and then the Hyrcanus dynasty started around 135 BC. All right, and this is when the Jewish sects arose during this time period of independence, during the Maccabean revolt, as they were able to kind of throw off the Syrians. And so we see the Pharisees and the Sadducees come to power during this time period. The high priest office became more political. They were appointed by whomever was in power. The high priests were appointed by whoever was in power would appoint the high priest. And at this end of this area, there were times of civil strife. The descendants of John Hyrcanus were plotting for the throne, and one of them invited Rome in for support. And it was not long before the Jews lost their independence once again. So we have Judea being caught up in this great power play, this struggle between the Egyptians and between the Syrians. Anytime that the Egyptians and the Syrians went to war, Judea was caught in the middle of that trap. And so a lot of wars took place, and Judea would get caught up in the middle, in between these two particular periods. I'm gonna go back and read that and go back to Daniel 8, 9 through 11, where it talks about and see the prophecy of Antiochus. Daniel 8, 9 through 11. Daniel chapter 8. And out of one of them came forth a little horn which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and it stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. So this is, and then later on, the next verses, 13, 14, we talks about the desolation of the temple. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint, and unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression and the desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So this is a prophecy about the sanctuary being that Antiochus Epiphanes would those things that he would do to the Jews in the temple, and outlawing, making all those practices illegal during this time period. All right, and so then it was now the period of independence where the Maccabees rose up and were able to finally kind of get some relief from this in-between position that they had been put in between the Egyptians and the Romans. All right, and so as we said, during this time period, Rome was invited in for support. And so then it's not long before the Jews are going to lose their independence. Their independence was very short-lived after they got out of the control of the Syrians, because then now the Romans will come in and put them under control of the Roman Empire. And so we get to this Roman Empire period. We see the Jews were conquered by Pompey the Great in 63 BC. Palestine was put under rulers responsible to Rome. And many of these we will read about in the Gospel accounts. So these Roman rulers, we'll read them. We actually see them in our biblical account. The Romans gave the Jews, now the Romans again, the Jews were very fortunate, and most of the time in other countries that occupied them, with the Egyptians, now with the Romans, that they were given a lot of concessions. The greatest significance to Christians is how the Roman period prepared the way for Christ. So Rome gave the Jews a lot of concessions. We see that during the crucifixion of Christ, how much leeway that the Jews had. In fact, when Jesus was being brought and put on trial by Pilate, the governor, that Pilate was like, hey, you take him, try him by your laws. You know, Pilate's like, I don't know anything about your laws. This seems to be a religious issue. This seems to be of you and your laws. You go and take them and try them according to your laws. The chief priests and the elders, you had the Sanhedrin. And so Pilate saying, you go and take them and do with them according to your laws and according to your ways. Just the only thing had to come to the Romans for was capital punishment. So there was a lot of leeway and concession given to the Jews by the Romans, because the Jews, their religion was different. A lot of people didn't understand it, didn't quite get the gist of what was going on with the Jewish religion. So they gave them the concession to kind of deal with that on their own. Yes. We're in the intertestament period. We're in between what's going on between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So this is between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Before, this is telling us what the scene is going to be like when Christ comes on the scene. So we're just setting the stage for that. So now we get the Romans in. They give the Jews a lot of concession. And so some of the significance that we have is some examples of the benefit that we have in our as we see how the Romans played out with how the gospel was prepared the way for Christ. We see the universal language of Greek. Greek is the universal language spread by Alexander the Great. When he came and conquered, he brought Greek. He brought Greek culture. He brought Greek philosophy, the Greek language. And so that became the language. Now, there were several languages in play during this time. You have Greek, you have Aramaic. Now, when the Jews went into captivity, and were in captivity, they learned Aramaic when they were in captivity. So when they came back, that's the language that was the everyday language that they spoke in the marketplace, was Aramaic. Hebrew is pretty much a dead language as far as a spoken language. Hebrew is still the religious language. The scriptures, the Old Testament is still written in Hebrew. The rabbis and the teachers at the synagogue still taught Hebrew school, and young Jewish boys were required to go to Hebrew school to learn Hebrew so that they could pick up the Torah and read the scriptures. And so they had to learn it to read it, but it was not a language that they particularly spoke. The rabbis in them could speak it, but not the everyday people, because they had been taken in captivity. So they lost the practice of speaking Hebrew because they learned the language of their captors. So we have Aramaic there. Now, go ahead, Brother Mike. Mm-hmm. So those that were with them, they heard the voice, but they didn't understand what it was. Yep, and see, Paul being, a Pharisee, Paul would grow up. He probably went to Hebrew school where the rabbis could read the law. So probably Paul was steeped in and able to read Hebrew and understand Hebrew. So it was limited to those who were in and around the religious sect that would understand Hebrew because it's not spoken. Now, the Romans language is Latin. So if anything that deals with the Romans, if you go with their legal laws, it was in Latin. So remember when Jesus was crucified and on his cross, the inscription was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. So it was written in those three languages. This is Jesus, King of the Jews, was inscribed over his head written in those three languages. So those are the languages of the time. It's fortunate because Greek is a very scientific language, a very precise language. And so it helps us a lot when we come from that original language and come to English, that we can go back through, because baptism means baptism. Baptism means a burial in Greek. There's no ways about it. That's what the word means in the original language. It is a burial immersion. So Greek is very good. It gives us time. It gives us date. It gives us location. It gives us place. You have masculine, feminine, and neuter. So words have an ending that tells if it's masculine, if it's feminine, or if it's neuter. So we have just so many things in Greek that make it a very precise language. So people would write, and a lot of the everyday transactions in life were in Greek. But in the marketplace and just in regular conversation, you speak Aramaic. Hebrew, so now Jesus spoke Aramaic, went to the temple, was able to pick up the scrolls, read the Hebrew scrolls. That's why the teachers marvel at him, like, how's he able to do all of this? Come up and pick up. Remember when he comes up and reads the scrolls and sits down? Well, that's in Hebrew. The scrolls would be in Hebrew. There is the Septuagint. There is a Greek translation for those that were non-Hebrew speaking people to understand the Hebrew text. But in the temple, you had to understand Hebrew, but Greek spoken. But then there's Aramaic. And then when I talked about how we got the Bible, I talked about some of those phrases. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, that's Aramaic. Eloi, Eloi, that's Aramaic. So we get some Aramaic things that were translated into our scriptures. That's Aramaic. And then, of course, Greek is the primary language. So the languages are important thing. The Greek language being a universal language, and for the New Testament. Now, the New Testament, the Old Testament composed in Hebrew, New Testament composed and written in Greek. So that is a benefit to us today. Then we have the Pax Romana, which is the peace of Rome. The Roman army, you have Roman roads. They say all roads lead to Rome. Everywhere the Roman government went, they built roads. They built highways, they built roads. One of the primary reasons for building those roads is so that they could march their army. These roads were brick, constructed, paved roads. They were wide enough so that they could march a fleet of their army down there. So they were built nice, wide, comfortable roads. So that allowed commerce, that allowed transportation, movement of ideas, communication on those Roman roads. But those roads during that time period could be dangerous. As you're out on the road, you could get hijacked, you could get waylaid. Hence the story of the Good Samaritan talks about a man that was traveling. What happened to him? Thieves and robbers jumped him and attacked him, and left him for dead. And then the Samaritan comes, takes care of him, puts him on his animal, takes him into town, and provides care. So roads during that time could be quite dangerous as you travel. Now, for roads to be dangerous and for robbers and hijackers and thieves to abound on the roads, that's not a good thing for business. That's terrible for commerce. That's terrible because what? Nobody would want to move. Nobody would want to go anywhere. Everybody would be afraid to travel and get on the road. So the Pax Romana is that Rome had put out laws. They had their soldiers. And so it created a peace that you could travel, that commerce could go back and forth on the roads, that you could pretty much travel anywhere within the Roman provinces without being attacked, without being hurt, because the Romans made sure that it was so. They had their armies, they had outposts, they had guards, plus they had laws that were in place to keep those kind of things down, because it was important for travel, for commerce, for people to be able to move without being hurt on the road. So that's a big thing. So that the gospel, because what? Paul is going to travel on those roads, and the gospel is going to travel on those roads. Jesus is going to travel on those roads. So it's important for the spread of the gospel throughout the Roman provinces, the Pax Romana, so that you could travel safely to and fro throughout the province. The building of a massive networks of roads, as I just said, permitted the empire-wide transportation and communications. Everywhere the Romans built, they built roads. You can still see them. They still exist today. The aqueducts. They built aqueducts that allowed water to move, so they can move water in the cities and have water. They built baths. Everywhere they went, they built waters and baths. Even as far as when I was in England, you could visit some of the Roman baths. And in Germany, in Trier, you can see the Roman baths. In Britain, you can see the Roman baths and the aqueducts and the works that they did. So everywhere Rome did, they built roads, they built communication networks. And so this went throughout the whole province. So now we can see why Paul would say Galatians 4:4, when the fullness of time was come, God said. So all these things are in place, a road system to allow people to move back and forth. It's going to allow the gospel and the church to develop over these roads. The peace of Rome, people are protected. They're able to travel and to move about and be protected because of the peace of Rome. The universal language, the gospel is going to be written in Greek, Koine Greek, which be able, so that means not only the Jews will be able to read it, but the Gentiles will be able to read it because it's in Greek. It's not they didn't have to translate it back into something else. It was written in the everyday language that people would understand. So that's going to be of great benefit to us, that universal language. So all of those things. So we asked the question at the beginning of the lesson, why did it take so long? Why did God wait that 400 years of silence before bringing his son in the world? Why didn't after Malachi end, why didn't the Lord just come? Well, the times wouldn't have been right. Plus, we have the prophecy of Daniel with those 4 kingdoms. Well, at the time of the Old Testament end, you're only on kingdom number 2. You have the Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, but then when the Old Testament ends, we have the Medes and the Persians. So we hadn't got to the Greeks and we hadn't got to the Romans. So we're 2 nations short. So God couldn't send his son at the end of the Old Testament period because according to Daniel's prophecy, there's 2 more nations that got to rise. So you can see God working through these natural events of how he shaped and how he brought his son in at the right time as these natural events did certain things. These wars and conquerors rose and fell, they left their marks on mankind. So we see Alexander the Great leaves a great mark because of Hellenism throughout the world, and that's going to benefit the gospel. That language is going to be there, that culture is going to be there, those philosophers. You're going to have the first university at Alexander. All those things are going to be beneficial to the story of Christianity. And then the peace of Rome, the building of the massive road networks, all will help out and benefit our Christian story, allow people to move. Plus, not only road networks, but ships. Paul could get on ships and sail from here and there because of all the commerce and transportation at that time. Yes. Yes, Emmett. Yes, sir. No, Matthew, Mark, they're part of the New Testament because they start off talking about John, John preparing the way, and then Christ. Well, during the time of Christ, we are still under the law. We're still under the Mosaical law. Yeah. We're still under the Mosaical law is still in effect during the time. The law ends with Christ's death on the cross, but then the establishment of the church. Because as Paul was saying in Colossians, he took away the handwriting of ordinances that were against us, and he nailed it to his cross. Paul would tell us that in Ephesians 2, that those who were far off were brought near by the blood of Christ. And so that atonement in his blood, and he took away those ordinances, took away the enmity that was against us. So the death of Christ officially ends that, but then the beginning of the church is when we get the official. When the church began, then we get the gospel age beginning. The Christian age begins with the beginning of the church. But he puts to death the law at the cross. But everybody doesn't know it yet until the beginning of the church and until his disciples go out and start to do what? Start to preach the gospel and talk about the good news and say, hey, that old system, that's done away with. Now you have to come to Christ. But yeah, Christ puts that to the end. He puts the door and he puts the nail in the coffin for the old law on the cross. When he dies on the cross, he brings that officially to an end. Yeah, so there's, like you say, there's a process that worked through all of this that led up to Christ coming, and it's very logical. And so as we look at that time period and see how God worked within in natural events, kings and stuff rising. So what makes us in our world today think that God is still not working through all this foolishness that we see going on? He's still working. He's still working. His purposes are still he worked through all of those things. And yes, a lot of people suffered. The Jews in Palestine suffered between the wars between Egypt, but God was still working through all of those events. So that should give us confidence as he worked then, as we see his providence then, it's still now. We should still have hope and have confidence that God is still using even the events that we're going through now. He's using them for his benefit. We just can't see it. It takes time for us to be able to see. As we look back, then we go, oh, that's what he was doing. That's what's going on. Even the people then didn't see it until they look back and can see that's what's doing it. So God is still shaping the times that we're living in today. So as we bring this to a close, we see that these 400 years must have been some important years. Just like I talked about those 400 years when the children of Israel were down in Egyptian bondage, those were some important years. Those weren't just some throwaway. Those were important. God is preparing, building a nation down there in Egypt. God is doing some things in Palestine and in Canaan. And so those years are important. And so the 400 years in between the Testament are important. We look at what was necessary for bringing in the Messiah. The Old Testament and the intertestamental period answers the questions, why did Jesus not come before the great flood or any other time period? Because the fullness of time had to be right for God to send his son. Those of us who live in the aftermath of Jesus' earthly ministry are blessed indeed, right? Because we're blessed because all of those things that lined up for God to come send his son in the world at precisely the right time, and look at all that we have. And so that's what we just try to help us understand a little bit today and appreciate the political landscape that took place during that time. It's going to be a time when the sects, like I say, the scribes and the Pharisees, all those people are going to come to power. And the scribes and the Pharisees are important parts of the story because what? They're going to become the greatest foes of Christ. They're going to be what? Every time he turns around, who's going to be there? Scribe or Pharisee or the Sadducees, what? Asking questions, trying to pick at Jesus, trying to get him to, to err or see if they can catch him in a trap. So they're going to be the biggest foils because the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, even the high priest and the Sanhedrin, all of those people are there to try to protect their position. They're Rome's on top. Then those religious leaders and the sects are kind of below. And then you have the common people all at the bottom. And so when Christ comes, he's threatening their position because he's telling the people, don't do as they say, but don't do as they do. Don't follow the examples. They're blind leaders of the God. They both fall. So he starts to pull the wool off of them and say, they're false leaders. They're not real leaders. These guys want to make these elaborate prayers in the temple, but they really don't care about people. They devour widows' houses. So they're going to be the Lord's greatest foes, but they come to power during this intertestamental period. So next time we'll talk about the land of Palestine. We'll look at the land of Palestine, changes in the designation, changes in the language. And then we'll talk more about changes in the worship because the temple system is out, the synagogue is in. So we'll talk about how that comes into place with the synagogue replacing the temple and why all of that takes place. So that'll be next week as we look at the land of Palestine where Jesus lived, look at those provinces, Judea and Samaria and Galilee, look at those areas that are key part of the Bible story. We'll look at those a little more deeper. So next week, just be prepared. You'll get in the email, you'll get your outline so that you can see the study questions, or we might still have have a stack of those with 20 lessons of the study questions all together. So anyway, look forward to seeing you on next Sunday, as we continue our walk through the life of Christ.